Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the first genealogy program of the new year. Today is January 11th, 2025. I'm Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center here in Canyon City, and we are coming to you, as always, from City Hall. I don't really have any announcements today, so we'll just kind of get right to it. But today's topic will be the Postal Service. And I'm really interested to learn about what Terri has to teach us today. We all depend on the Postal Service a lot. And I always kind of wonder with, the technology we have today, how they pull it off. But they've been doing this for a long time without that technology. So I'll be interested to hear more. I will hand it over to our presenter, Terri Meeks.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. Since January celebrates the month of Benjamin Franklin's birth on January 17th, I thought the Postal Service would be a good topic to delve into. So, excuse me. So, to get started, in the colonial era, there was no postal service until the late 17th century. People would write letters to their friends, but they did not use a postal service. They used friends, relatives, people that were going to other areas to transport their mail. So they didn't have an organized system. It was the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early to mid 1600s, that early, that did establish a postal system. And it was at Richard Fairbank's Tavern in Boston. He was the official mail delivery site for letters and parcels going to and coming from overseas. It's really interesting to note that people did not write to each other in the same community or neighboring communities. For the most part, they were interested in hearing the news from home, what was going on back in England or where their native roots were. So government business was conducted through letters that came on pack boats or schooners, ships that came across the Atlantic. In most cases, people would hire someone to carry a letter, and it could go overland or by a ship to another colony. But it was a personal interaction rather than an organization. This is a drawing of Richard Fairbank's Tavern. He was born in England in 1588, and he and his wife Elizabeth immigrated to the colonies in about 1634. So he opened his post office within about the first 5 years, and he held that post office contract through until his death in 1667. So a good 30 years. As each of the colonies was settled, the various governors or the founders of the colonies did open post offices. They had a monthly system to get mail from one point to another. In New York, for example, it went from New York to Boston via what was called the Post Road. Post roads followed original trails, original Indian trails, and riders would go via horseback to carry letters. In the South, it was primarily messengers that did the exact same thing. In 1691, Thomas Neal, he was an Englishman, he received a 21-year grant from the Crown for a postal service. Neal never came to America and never really instituted the Postal Service. He sold his grant to Andrew Hamilton and an R. West. They, in turn, lost their grant, and it was bought back by the British government in 1707. And finally, the government appointed John Hamilton as the Deputy Postmaster General of America. Now, this is all colonial postal service, British postal service. In 1692, William and Mary were the King and Queen of England, and they established a postmaster in each of the existing colonies. So there were colonial postmasters. And it's interesting to note that one of the first long distance runs under the Crown Postal Service was from Williamsburg, Virginia to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we get to our hero, Benjamin Franklin. In 1637, he was the city, Philadelphia, postmaster. Frequently, printers were appointed as postmasters, and there was quite a bit of vying for that position. Printers usually printed newspapers, and what better way to get the news to the population than by printing the newspaper and sending it through the Postal Service. So this was a coveted position. Postal rates were very low for the newspapers, and that's another reason that the printers vied for this office. And they decided which newspapers could travel for free in the mail. So by 1753, Franklin was deputy postmaster for British North America. And he did a lot. He had a lot of accomplishments. He expanded the mail service from the United States to Canada. He introduced a uniform accounting system for all postmasters throughout all of the colonies. He started overnight deliveries between Philadelphia and New York City. And he instituted the penny post. Letters were delivered to a central location, just like the tavern that we saw earlier. They were not delivered to individual homes. So if a letter was delivered to a central location and it was not claimed, it was the penny post that then had someone deliver it to an individual residence, and they charged a penny. He developed the dead letter office for undeliverable letters, and he began a system of the packet ships for the delivery of mail abroad. These were small ships, and their stated purpose was to transport cargo and the mail. However, as we approached the American Revolution, Benjamin Franklin did take part in writing letters against the crown, and so he was dismissed from his position. Hugh Finley was another major figure in the Postal Service at this time. In 1763, he was put in charge of the Colonial Post Office in the Canadian Territory by Franklin. So In 1772, he was appointed Postmaster General and also a postal surveyor. He mapped the most expedient routes from British North America, and he essentially mapped the entire region from Quebec down to Savannah. And one of the greatest things is that he maintained a journal. And in that journal, he recorded postal happenings, but he also recorded the geography. He was not a cartographer. He did not make maps. He did do some small illustrations, but he gave complete descriptions of the area. And here is a page from his journal. At the top, he says, "From this tavern, we see the town of Wilmington at the end of an avenue, cut through an island 2 miles across. This island is in Cape Fear River and flows in the manner here described." And we do see a little drawing. Further down, he went to the tavern, and while I sat there, the postal rider delivered a parcel of newspapers to a person in the room, demanding an amount for his trouble. Finley stepped in and reprimanded the rider and forbid him from taking any money. And that's what's in that third paragraph. As we approach the revolution, we see more and more protests. And as part of that, British postal routes were destroyed and interrupted. And one of the reasons here again was that it was taxation without representation. The postage rates were set by the crown, and that's a form of taxation without representation. William Goddard organized an American postal system that was independent of the British system. And in many cities, this system did compete successfully with the crowns. By 1775, there was an entire network of these American postal systems and post offices and postmasters. And this was known as the Constitutional Post. Goddard actually submitted a petition, and he actually, by Christmas Day in 1775, forced the Crown Post Service out of business. The Constitutional Post ensured communication between the patriots and kept the populace informed about events during the American Revolution. And it did become the foundation for what today is the United States postal system. It was during the Second Continental Congress in 1776 that Franklin was appointed the first Postmaster General. And this is a copy of Goddard's petition. And in it, he repeatedly states the fact taxation without representation and our need for an independent system. In 1789, President George Washington appointed Samuel Osgood as the first American Postmaster General. And by this time, there were 75 official post offices and about 2,000 miles of post roads. For the most part, it was postal riders, horseback riders, who were delivering the mail from one central point to another central point. In 1792, the Constitution empowered the first recognized post office department, and it was opened in Philadelphia. And as I've said, there was a central location, so people had to go to the post office to actually pick up their mail. So let's look at the different modes of transportation that have been used by the post office system throughout the years. If you have a relative or family member that has worked for the Postal Service, this is one of those opportunities to dig deeper into your genealogical history. Someone may have been a post office employee, but in the 1800s, that was very, very different from what we have today. So it's important to dig a little deeper to find out, where did they work? Under what circumstances did they work? Were they a horse rider? Were they a stagecoach rider? Did they have a contract with the government to deliver the mail? And this information is available from various sources that we'll talk about later. So by 1800, the Postal Service had purchased a number of stagecoaches. The roads were in better condition. There were some, Indian trails had been improved. Actual Postal Service routes were established, which made for better conditions and allowed stagecoaches to go across them. Contracts were granted to stagecoach lines, and initially they linked the eastern communities. And the mail was carried under the driver's seat for protection. In the mid-1800s, the Butterfield Overland Mail Stage Line was awarded a contract. And this covered a 2,800-mile route, and we'll see a map of this from Missouri to San Francisco. But it took 24 days to get there. And we see from this picture, we see a hollowed out stagecoach, but we see that the driver's seat up above is labeled U.S. Mail below. And here is a map of that Butterfield Overland Mail. And to realize in the mid-1800s that it took 24 days, and we can see why. We also see in census records that the Overland Mail, and we see quite a group of these folks in New Mexico who are either station keepers and herders. So the post office employed other professions other than just mail carriers. There were herders, there were other employment opportunities within the Postal Service. So don't overlook some of these. They also had a system of star routes. This was a mail delivery service that used private contractors, just like the Overland Stage, but it was to transport mail in rural and thinly populated areas also that might have been difficult to get to. Contractors had the freedom to determine what route they were going to use and what method to deliver the mail. Were they going to use a stagecoach? Were they going to use just a horse or a mule team or some other form? So stagecoaches and their contracts were expensive. And even though they were favored over horses on certain routes, the star routes did take a lot of the population and the mail. Most most of the star route carriers traveled by mail, but there were others that went by boats, sleds, snowshoe, skis. They had mule trains into the Grand Canyon, and whatever method it took to get the mail through. And we see some or a single horseback rider, mail carrier, and we see the other animals that are actually carrying the mail into, and this happens to be the Grand Canyon area. Early on, steamboats were actually used. There might not have been roads, so rivers and canals were the easiest way to get the mail through. They did ferry mail from the East Coast and especially along the Mississippi River, but other rivers also were used to carry the mail. Here again, just like the overland stage in the mid-1800s, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company was awarded a contract to transport mail from the East Coast to California and Oregon. Mail went by ship from the East Coast ports down to Panama, and there they hired horse teams to go across the Isthmus of Panama, and that took probably about 3 weeks. It was a monthly, and when they got to the West Coast, then it got loaded, the mail was loaded back onto ships again to go to the ports in California as well as Oregon. This totally took about 6 weeks for mail to get through. It was a monthly service and it ran until 1925, which I was surprised to see. And it was during this period of 1860 and 1861 that the Pony Express got started in order to shorten that 6-week time to go overland with the mail. And I have done a complete presentation on the Pony Express previously that is available on the museum's YouTube channel. Here is one of those Pacific mail ships named California. And we see also from non-population schedules that the Pacific Mail Steamship Company had in this area a foundry and a machine shop. And this talks about the assets that they had. So if one of your people might have worked for them in this locality, they might have worked in the foundry or machine shop. Here again, you had to keep the ships in tip-top condition to carry the mail. And we do see an Edward Flug, and he did work for the Pacific Steamship Company. Trains. Railway mail service began in 1832, and it grew until the Civil War. During the Civil War, the U.S. Postal Service stopped delivering mail between the Federals and the Confederates. It was just within the northern states and the non-slavery states that the Postal Service worked. Mail was, it was forbidden by law to go between the two, either Confederacy or Union, but people did sneak correspondence. Here again, they relied on individuals that might have been visiting to hand carry and hand deliver correspondence. In 1862, they also started a system on the railway where mail was actually sorted along the route in the cars, the mail cars, between 2 points. And they also had mail cranes that were used to exchange the mail at stations, so that the train could not stop. They would put a bag up and they would capture a bag from the train. With the decline in passenger traffic in the 1930s, it led to a decline in mail on the trains. The mail service instead moved to highway buses. And they did have buses and they did have sorting on the buses between two major points. And here's a picture from on the railway where they are sorting the mail. This is one of those bags along the route. The circle indicated that there was, normally this pole would be in a vertical position. When it was in the horizontal position, this indicated to the train that they had mail to pick up. And it would swing around and the train would then deposit mail on the other end in order without having to stop. And there's a film on the internet that shows how this works. And we see that Mr. Brown is a railroad mail service employee. We also see from city directories, and this is as late as 1904, that Mr. Batterton is a mail rail postal clerk. Individual vehicles. In 1899, the electric automobile was introduced, and at the very, very beginning of the century, both electric, steam, and gas-powered vehicles were used by the Postal Service. They were more expensive to use, but they did cover the distance in half of the time. So by 1909, electric mail trucks were used in New York City and Boston. They had shorter routes so that they could go back. There were more vehicles, but shorter routes. So electric vehicles were very cost effective. In 1913, parcel post began. So they were introducing packages and the delivery of packages. Here's a Winton electric automobile in 1899 that is delivering the mail in Ohio in the snow. And here we see Mr. Fred Ingersoll in the brush runabout. Mr. Ingersoll was, in 1910, he was a mail carrier in Pasadena, California. And he endorsed this car and used it on the Postal Service. You'll note that behind him it says USM. He was using this for mail. And the advertisement talks about the efficiency of the vehicle and it never breaks down, etc. The ideal vehicle for mail delivery. By 1913, they had actually purchased 41 vehicles to test in 10 cities to see if owning the vehicles might be cheaper than leasing them. And as we've seen, that has been what has been employed since. And they did switch from electric and steam to gas-powered vehicles, especially as the automobile industry matured. And we have our current some of our current vehicles. Others are in testing. As early as 1911, there was the first airmail flight. And these flights, for a period of time between 1912 and 1916, these were experimental flights, fairs and carnivals in many of the states were as a stunt to attract people to come to the fair. They would advertise that they were going to deliver the mail. In 1916, Congress did authorize money for airmail experiments, and they did enlist the Army Signal Corps to operate the airmail service. And one of the reasons for this was it gave pilots more cross-country flying hours, as well as getting the mail to the far distant points more rapidly. And here we see one of those first scheduled flights. From 1918 to 1925, the Postal Department actually hired 200 pilots. And after 1925, most of the airmail was flown by private contractors. And we see mail go by commercial airlines today. There is a listing on the Postal Service website of those 200 mail carriers that operated between 1918 and 1925, along with the routes that they used at the particular dates. And we see in city directories that Mr. Kudabak was a chief pilot with the airmail service, and this is in Idaho. We see also in the US Census, we see an aviator doing airmail. The post office has taken advantage of other modes of transportation. In the 1850s, wagon trains also transported mail westward. The military has been used to carry mail. We also, in 1859, there was mail by a balloon. And as I mentioned earlier, the Pony Express. And from 1899 into the 1910s, the teens, Alaska used reindeer to deliver the mail. And in the early 20th century, they experimented with motorcycles. Here we see Mr. John Wise in Lafayette, Indiana, in 1859, taking off in a balloon to deliver mail. The red stars and the lines that connect them. This was an Alaska map from 1903, and the red stars represent post offices receiving mail by reindeer. This is an article from the Goldsboro Weekly Argus. The people who live in the frontier mining camps of Colorado, Idaho, Utah, and Montana have been snowed in for the past 3 months. They are as much out of civilization as if they lived in Alaska. Nevertheless, these people want their letters and papers, the same as do the people of our towns and cities. The Post Office Department is enterprising, and it undertakes to give them an irregular mail service. This branch of the Postal Service is called the snowshoe mail because the mountain carriers travel on snowshoes. There are 40 or 50 of these mail carriers who are not afraid to brave the dangers. It is no easy task to climb the steep mountainsides in summertime, but how much more difficult in snowy weather when the trails are obscure and misleading, when snow is 4 to 5 feet deep on the level, when the thermometer is below zero, when a misstep would send a carrier over the precipice. And here is that experiment with the motorcycle. It's interesting, he's got his fishing poles on there and a suitcase. So, post offices. As I mentioned earlier, they were established in 1776 in each state, and actually before each state was formed. Now, you have to realize that the boundaries and the names of counties and states and territories did change sometimes, but there is a listing. The 13 original colonies and 1775 is considered the establishment date for the post offices in those states. The appointment of a postmaster was generally considered the establishment of an office. So in colonial times, when a postmaster was appointed, that meant a post office was established. And we do see a listing here of the various towns within the states. And these are the earliest post offices that were open in those states. And we do see New Hampshire and New Jersey with that colonial 1775 date. By 1837, cities were growing. And rather than having a single postal service, remember, there was one point where mail was delivered. So at this point, when cities were growing, they needed to create branches and other stations so that people could use those places to drop off and pick up mail. In 1863, free city delivery did begin. And stations were created, and some smaller post offices were consolidated in conjunction with this free city delivery. By 1899, rural stations were established with free rural delivery service. And here is one of those branches, a Washington Heights station of the Chicago Post Office. So it was in a neighborhood where a larger section of population could go to a single point here again to pick up their mail. We also have military installations, Camp Wyckoff in New York, and this is their post office. Temporary stations and branches were also opened when they had the World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1776. At the World's Fair, they actually set up a branch of the Postal Service. In the 1880s, there were contract stations. Here again, they went to drugstores and other businesses, places where people frequented, and that were more convenient for postal services and facilities. And these contracting services were cheaper than hiring clerks to work in and establishing separate buildings within the Postal Service. So by 1898, for the Spanish-American War, postal stations were opened in military camps. It's interesting to realize that postal rates, they needed to be paid, started with Mr. Franklin. He published a table of postal rates. Originally, they were charged by the number of sheets in a letter and the distance that it would travel. And Franklin established a more set rate for these. Postage stamps didn't come about until about 1847, so a lengthy period of time between Mr. Franklin's rates. The postmaster would note in the upper right-hand corner of a letter what the postage would be, and the postage could be paid either by the sender or the receiver. So I wonder how many letters went unclaimed. I apologize for the faintness of this, but this is Mr. Franklin's chart on how he determined, and I have not been able to clearly decipher any of this, but there was a uniform system for the number of pages and the distance. In 1842, a New York City carrier issued the first adhesive stamp, and the post office bought his business and continued to use his stamps for service in New York City. In 1845, postage rates were simplified, and they settled on actually two different rates. In New York City, Postmaster Robert Morris provided special stamps to indicate payment of the post office postage, and these were known as post office postmasters provisionals. And if you're a stamp collector, these are extremely rare and valuable. These are provisionals. This is one, a 5-cent one from Providence, Rhode Island, and it's that individual post office. It's not U.S. mail. Here's another one from St. Louis, and one from New York. So in 1847, Congress authorized two postage stamps, a 5-cent stamp that had the image of Franklin on it, and a 10-cent stamp that had the picture of George Washington. Clerks used scissors to cut the stamps from pre-gummed sheets. And beginning in 1856, prepaid postage was required, so the sender was the one responsible. And here are those original stamps. And it's interesting to me that they used the X, the Roman numeral, for the 10-cent. And it does say U.S. Post Office. So in 1863, mail delivery began in large cities. In 1868, Congress passed legislation authorizing uniforms for letter carriers. And they did have separate hot weather gear by 1873. Letter carriers were required to carry numbered badges, and they were worn on their hats. And this is in the 1887 time frame. And by 1901, carriers could take off their coats in hot weather. And we do see Postal Service uniforms today, and some of them are hot weather, Some of them are cold weather uniforms. Here is just one sample. We see the mail carrier's bag and their uniforms, and you'll notice the little emblems on the fronts of their caps that do have numbers on them. And here is one of the close-ups for one of those. So where do you find information about the Postal Service and the carriers? The census, obviously, we have seen from some of the examples where people were actually listed as mail carriers, mail clerks. This is the easy part. You can identify that your ancestor, for example, was working for the post office or as a contractor for the post office. It is in the city directories in those intervening 10-year timeframes that we turn to see, did somebody start working in the post office in 1882? The 1890 census was burned, so those city directories are potentially a vital source of information for postal workers between 1880 and 1900. On Ancestry, there also is a file of appointments of U.S. postmasters from the years 1832 to 1971. So if your ancestor might have been a postmaster, even for a brief period of time, they might be listed in this record as well. Just doing a simple Google search for postal history, there are some really good books, and there is a National Postal Museum. The post office itself does have a good history and a good breakdown of a lot of the information that I have given you today. So let's take a look at the census. We do see simply a mail carrier, Mr. John Decker. And we see again the overland mail and the station keeper, cooks, herders, a stage driver, a laborer, and in one case, towards the bottom, is a well digger. These people all worked for the overland mail. So different occupations other than what we traditionally think of for the mail. In 1870, we see Mr. John Rondy, and we see that $20,000. He's an accountant for the Pacific Mail. So here again, a different occupation, but within Postal Service information. In 1880, we see Frank Thomason, and he is a U.S. mail contractor. 1900, John Noel, a mail clerk. 1920, Guy Savage, a railroad mail service. And in 1930, Irvin Below, an air pilot for the air mail. So you may know that your ancestor worked for the Postal Service, but in what aspect did they work? In looking at city directories, here again, we see Thomas Nye. He is with the Overland Mail in San Francisco, and he is a mail clerk. And between those census years, here in Pueblo, we have Mr. Griffin, who's a cashier for the overland mail. 1884, Captain W.C. Shackford, and he works for the Pacific Mail Steamship Line. Mr. Paul Watts, a rural mail carrier on Route 1. Very specific. And in 1938, Carl Sundberg, a mail carrier, an air mail carrier, but he also worked for a real estate company. And as late as 1955, we have Mrs. F. Eileen, and she's an airmail messenger. Here is that website for U.S. postmasters that is on Ancestry. If you have a specific name that you are looking for, you can enter that, or you can just browse the information. It does give the person's name, when they were appointed, the cause for the vacancy and their vacancy date, the post office location, the state, county, and a volume number. And I have found that not all the records have all of that information, and some of them have even a little bit more information. Here, for example, is Greene County, Alabama, and we see, for example, in the city of Clinton, we have Robert Adamford being appointed and his date of appointment, and who his successor was and their dates. In Bucks County, Pennsylvania, we have the town and who was appointed postmaster and who took over afterwards. And some of these appointments were very short, others of these were very long. And here's one from Michigan that is later in time, in the 19-teens. So newspapers are also a wonderful source of information. In many, many cases, they do not give individual names, but they do give thrilling testimony as to what happened on some of these postal routes. This one happens to be from the 1857, the Polynesian in Hawaii, which at the time was still a kingdom. And the article goes on to talk about they're going to reestablish the overland mail carriers throughout the kingdom. And it goes through each island and which day of the week and the schedule for the mail for each one of the islands. In 1883, we get a mail carrier's adventure. And this was a gentleman named Snowshoe Thompson, who was a mail carrier in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And he was faced by a grizzly. He had taken shelter in a small hut. He did have a lance with him, but the hut was so small that when the bear came into the cabin, he didn't have room his lance was long, so he couldn't pull back on the lance to thrust it into the bear. He threw something out that attracted the bear. The bear went outside and discovered that it wasn't anything he was interested in. He turned around, and Mr. Snowshoe Thompson used the lance to stab and kill the bear. This is another case of Mr. Jim Beer Grease. And people actually thought that he had been dead. He had disappeared for months. And actually, he had been attacked by a pack of wolves. This is an 1899 article and explains how mail is transferred from a large steamer to a small boat and vice versa, and the efforts that the mailman and the sailor had to go through in order to lash the small boat close to the steamer and then throw the mail up to the steamer and receive the mail from the steamer. And here's a story about a young lady who gave up her graduation to take over her father's mail route during a blizzard, serving 400 families. So there are also a number of books that talk about the history of the Postal Service. And some of the more interesting ones are those with older publication dates. But we get the history of the Postal Service from the earliest times, the traveling post office, and this one is about the railway mail service. And we see some of the chapters that might give information. And it's also interesting to note that there was actually a postal dog, Oni. He was a puppy in Albany, New York, and he was found in the post office in 1888. And he always stayed close to the post office. And he actually began riding in mail wagons to and from the depot. And eventually, he actually got on the trains and went to other destinations. And fearing that he could get lost, the postal workers made a collar for him so that he could be returned if he should get lost. And they recorded his travels. They had metal tags that they attached to his collar, and he eventually saw significant parts of the world. He died in 1897 as a 9-year-old, and in 2011, he was honored with a commemorative postage stamp. And there is a stuffed Oni with his baggage tags and his postage stamp. Very, very quickly, 24-year-old Abraham Lincoln was a postage worker in New Salem, Illinois for a couple of years. And he could send and receive personal letters and get one daily newspaper for free. Fred Harvey of the Harvey House chain of restaurants and hotels worked as a mail sorter on a train in 1862. And other more current people that we might know: Walt Disney, Bing Crosby, Conrad Hilton, Charles Lindbergh worked for the Postal Service at some point. This is the Postal Service website, and you can see the various opportunities. Actually, this is the Postal Museum website, I'm sorry. And they have various articles and publications. So if you're looking for information, this might be a rich source for that. And finally, I introduced parcel post back in 1913, and this actually did happen. So that's all we have for today. Here again, look for the deeper story. You may find your relative in the Postal Service in a census or in a city directory. But what aspect of the Postal Service did they serve in? What was their job? There is a long-standing tradition, hundreds of years now, for work in the Postal Service. Honor that tradition. I'll turn it back to Jessica for any announcements.
Thank you, Terry. That was great. What a rich history of the Postal Service. We do have a comment here from Terry, one of our program participants today. We love hearing from you guys, so thank you for dropping this in here, Terry. It says, my father worked for the post office garage as a mechanic, another occupation of the post office. Got to keep those vehicles going. Very good. Yes, thank you to your father for his service, and that is a very important part of this process. I wanted to just real quick, a couple of things. The postal carrier motto, neither rain nor snow, nor sleet nor hail shall keep the postmen from their appointed rounds. Man, thinking about these snowshoe carriers and all the trains and the boats and fighting off grizzly bears, I mean, they took it to a whole nother level. All right. All right. Well, one other thing I wanted to add real quick. You had mentioned the temporary stations, and here locally, when Glenn Gebhardt first opened his Royal Gorge Pavilion, he was the first concessionaire up at the Royal Gorge. They opened a temporary postal station up there. He was a photographer. He had pre-printed up postcards of his work, and they opened in the summer months. They had a temporary postal drop up there.
Yes, the same with the World's Fairs. It started in 1876, but each one of the World's Fairs and expositions, so that you could have the specific stamp for that city and that fair. They were issued, just like Mr. Gebhardt's.
That's very cool. Okay, well, join us back here next month, February 8th, we'll discuss the Green Book. I know that there was a couple of businesses here locally listed in the book, and we are looking forward to learning more. Thank you, Terry.